So the Founding Fathers, as we now call them, they didn't call them that initially, of course, but as the Founding Fathers gather in Philadelphia, the year 1787, a very hot and humid summer. This is the convention, right? The Constitutional Convention to amend the Articles of Confederation. 3 broad procedural choices are made at the outset that are quite significant here. Number 1, a decision is made that not only will George Washington be a delegate to the convention, but he will preside over the proceedings. I don't know that he ever really contributed any to the debates over the Constitution, because again, that really wasn't his strong suit. He was a man of action, not so much a man of words. But, right, remember what we said, right? As Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, he was quite inspirational to his men. So I think that's the same purpose that he's serving here. And he makes a decision, by the way, a sartorial decision to wear his full sort of military regalia while he presides over the convention, right? So he's kind of communicating, right, sort of symbolically, hey, I was the hero of the American Revolution. I made all of this possible in many ways. I'm indispensable. You know, look, if you end up creating a form of governance in which there's a president, you might want to think about this guy here. All right, so he presides, and that's probably, right, probably makes it more likely that the founders are going to get things done to sort of make good on his hard work as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He's an inspiring figure. Number 2, a decision is made to keep these proceedings secret over the summer. It is said, I don't know if it's true or not, but if it's not, it should be, that they decided to nail the windows shut to prevent the media or anybody else from getting wind of what they were doing. And their argument was, look, if people start to find out early on what it is we're doing, because it's going to be a big deal no matter what we do, because we're setting the rules of the game for the country. If leaks happen early on, that might start to build opposition, and it might become problematic over time. All right, so to prevent that, we're going to keep things on the down low until we're finished. Now look, once we're finished, we'll release it to the public for debate and ratification. But until then, we want to keep it all on the down low. So I think that was an important decision. Not something we would tolerate today, right? We wouldn't tolerate that today. And then third, they make a decision to be extra controversial that although their grant of authority from the Continental Congress is to amend the articles, they decide that these articles are hopeless. They're fundamentally hopeless, and we need to really just get rid of them and start over with a blank sheet of parchment. So that's indeed what they do. All right, now I want to lay out the core principles that emerged from that convention. I don't love the way our book organizes this part of the analysis. They kind of lay out the broad concept at the outset, right? This thing called the Great Compromise that we'll get to in a bit. Then they talk about ratification, and then they talk about what comes out of that. I want to put everything on the front end. What do they accomplish at that convention? We'll talk about that before we talk about the debate over ratification. So number 1, a much stronger national government than we had under the Articles. Remember, that was the key defect of the Articles. So here they fix that in a really fundamental way. They make it very clear. Look, push comes to shove, the national government is decisively more powerful than the states. And they even build into it a thing called the Supremacy Clause, that when there's a conflict between the national government and the states, generally speaking, the national government will prevail. The Supremacy Clause. Number 2, and related to that, at the national level, 3 branches of government. And I'll expand upon that in just a bit, but for now, the 3 branches, right? Legislative, executive, and judicial. 3 relatively powerful branches. Third point, related to that, Congress designed to be first among equals. Article 1, Congress, the powers of Congress, Article 1, Section 8. The courts, the federal courts, meant to be the least dangerous branch in the brilliant language of Alexander Hamilton, who was a beast at that convention. I say the big three at the convention will be Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Adams. All right. And then the executive branch, somewhere in between those other two branches, right? So Article 1, the powers of Congress. Article 2, the powers of the executive branch. Article 3, the powers of the federal courts. That was by design. You know, we often talk about the three co-equal branches. There's something to be said for that claim, but it's also true that they meant there to be some element of hierarchy between the three branches. Congress as preeminent, the executive as somewhat secondary, and the courts as least dangerous. Key principles continued. The Founding Fathers at that convention create a legislative branch called the U.S. Congress that is bicameral in nature, right? Two houses. And very notably and importantly, the U.S. Senate represents each state equally, right? 2 senators from every state, back then 13, today 50. That was right, a deal designed to satisfy the concerns of the smaller states that if they didn't get equal representation in the U.S. Congress, at least in the Senate, they would be dominated by the big states. And then in the House, right, representation would be by population, where the bigger states would have more power, as arguably they should since they have more people. So this is called the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise. I don't know. It troubles me a bit, especially today when we have California with about 40 million people, Wyoming with about 500,000. Each state gets 2 senators. Strikes me as problematic. That 40 million people get the same representation as 500,000 people. What the heck? Seems to me that the central political entity in a democracy is we the people and not the states per se. But, look, maybe the founders got it right. Maybe they didn't. But that's what they do, right? They create this compromise between those who wanted representation by population, i.e. by we the people, and those who wanted the states to continue to be central actors, each having the same power as every other state, no matter how big, no matter how small. Point number 5, slavery was protected. Right? This is our original sin. We see it right here on parchment. And you'll note if you look at the language used in all 3 of these pro-slavery provisions, they never used the term slave or slavery. They used deflected, indirect, legalistic sounding language that sort of gives them, I don't know, plausible deniability that they're doing something that's fairly evil, quite honestly. Like all other persons is one of the phrases that they use. Well, all other persons in that case were slaves, come on. Call it what it is, own it, but they don't. So there's the 3/5 compromise, the one that we're most familiar with, right? That the southern states with large slave populations, unlike the northern states, large slave populations, they could count those slave populations for purposes of representation in the House, even though these were slaves and not citizens, could not vote, right? There were a small number of free blacks even in the South at this time, but a very small number. Most of the free blacks were up north, and there weren't many of them there either. So yeah, they could count each slave as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation in the House of Reps in Congress, which gave the southern states a lot more representation in the House than they really deserved. But it's what they demanded from the North, and they got it. A pretty shameful compromise. Second, they do permit a future ban by Congress on the slave trade from Africa. It says that Congress can ban it if they so wish after about 20 years. All right, so they do allow a future ban on the slave trade, and indeed, when that year arrives, I think it was 1807, 1808, Congress does exactly that. But I always emphasize here, that wasn't such a big deal for the South, right? That was not really much of a concession, if any, to the North. Because look, there were already a lot of slaves in 1787, and by 1807 there was going to be a whole lot more. right? So if you cut off the slave trade, then it hardly matters, right? You already have a large slave population, and because of the nature of us humans, you're going to get reproduction, and that'll provide all the slaves the South needs without imports from Africa. And if anything, right, the ban on importation in 1807 is going to increase the value of the slaves that they hold in the South, right? Because of, simple economics. If demand remains constant or goes up and supply is limited, constricted by banning imports, right, the price goes up. So the South made it seem like they were compromising on this with the North, but they really weren't. They really weren't. And then finally, the Fugitive Slave Clause. This was particularly pernicious because it said, essentially, any slave that escapes, and they don't use the term slave, but any person as the state shall designate, or some neutral-sounding language like that. They said any slave that escapes from the South and makes it to the North into a free state, that free state in the North is obligated constitutionally to facilitate the return of that slave back to the owner in the South. So this implicates the North, right, in the institution of slavery quite closely. Again, a great deal for the South, bad deal for slaves, right? This is our original sin. And we should note, if you've ever seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, that what this permitted de facto, it permitted, what are they called? Those people who, even today, bounty hunters, right? Who, if someone doesn't show up for court, they'll hunt them down because they've provided their bond. And if that person doesn't show up for court, right, the bond company loses money. So the bond company has bounty hunters that will hunt these people down and bring them to court so the bond company can get its money. Same thing here, right? So what would happen is you get these bounty hunters from the South will go up north to a place like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They see a black man on the streets. They would seize them physically and accuse them of being an escaped slave. And unless that free black man in the North could prove with legal papers that they were indeed a free black man, the presumption was that they were an escaped slave from the South. And back then, court records, pretty thin, pretty chancy, pretty questionable, often didn't exist. Right? So a lot of these black men seized on the streets by bounty hunters in the North didn't have the papers to prove their status as free black men. So they could then legally be taken back to the South and sold into slavery. So these were those three so-called compromises on slavery that overwhelmingly favored the South and built slavery into our Constitution from the get-go. Shameful. I mean, arguably, right, it's what the North had to do to get a deal. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't call it out as shameful, because it visits upon us right to the present some serious problems with race. So they were essentially, right, sort of kicking the can down the road for future generations to deal with. Hell, Jefferson himself said, "When I reflect that God is just, I tremble for America," because he knew that there was going to be hell to pay for having the institution of slavery. And he was quite right. And yet he himself had over 200 slaves. And then finally, number 6 there, limited government, right? Remember how we talked about that? John Locke said that we need limited government, not a Leviathan, as per Thomas Hobbes. Limited government. How do we achieve that? In 2 ways. Checks and balances. Checks and balances, right? Where you do create a Congress, but you have 2 houses that share power. You have an executive branch that shares power with the legislature, that shares power with the courts, right? The courts can check the power of the president. The president can choose federal justices and justices. The Senate provides advice and consent. The court can strike down laws passed by Congress. Congress can limit the jurisdiction of the federal courts. Plus, they provide advice and consent on nominations to the federal bench. A pretty brilliant system of checks and balances, right? To limit power, you fragment power. You divide it up between the 3 branches of government at the national level. And, right, as we talked about, through federalism, national, state, and local. You divide that power up to limit it, fragment it. And then second, a government of enumerated powers, right? Congress only has the powers given to it in Article 1, Section 8. It's got to be found in that language to have that power. The president only has the powers listed in Article 2. The courts only have the powers listed in Article 3. So for the courts, the president, the Congress to exercise power, they've got to locate that exercise within the language of Articles 1, 2, and 3. All right, a government of enumerated powers. All right, two more points here, points 7 and 8, sorry. Because again, I'm sort of taking disparate elements from what our authors provide in chapter 2, and I'm bringing it all together. Point number 7, key principles of the Constitution, limits on democracy, right? Limits on democracy. What did the founders say about voting, elections, and suffrage? Leave it up to the states, right? Leave it up to the states. Well, you know, if you're Thomas Paine, that's problematic. Because what do all 13 states decide right from the get-go? They're going to take that discretionary power and use it to dramatically limit suffrage to only propertied white men. It is estimated maybe about 6% of us could vote at the beginning. So, you know, the Founding Fathers made that possible by allowing the states to make exactly that choice. You know, and we've talked about that before. Maybe it made sense back then. You can certainly make the argument. But it's also true, right, that today we've rejected that approach and dramatically expanded suffrage. The U.S. Senate, right, how was that designed by the founders? To be elected by state legislative bodies, right? So if that were still the case today, the Nevada legislature would elect our senators. That's clearly not how it works, right? That by the early 20th century, because of progressive reforms, we got rid of that approach and said, no, senators will be elected just like members of the House of Reps, right, by we the people, of course. But initially, right, the Senate was insulated from direct popular pressure. The federal courts, right, then and now, and today I think we would mostly justify that as legitimate then, legitimate now. The federal courts, right, are occupied by judges and justices nominated by the president with the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate, right, insulated from direct popular pressure. But we would say, right, that makes sense perhaps because the courts should be insulated from direct popular pressure, perhaps. Slavery, right? Slavery violates basic democratic principles that we are, you know, endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the founders, as we've seen, build slavery right into the Constitution, thereby undercutting a basic democratic principle. We do fix that, all right, with the Civil War and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But, you know, there's still work to be done there, as we've discussed. So we inherit a hell of a thing there from the Founding Fathers. And then finally, right, an electoral college that elects the president. What we have, and we'll get to this much later in the course, when we elect a president, right, it's not done directly by a national popular vote. If it was, right, Donald Trump never would have been president. And Al Gore would have been president and not George W. Bush. But what we do instead, right, is that each state has a separate state election for president. And then typically they award all of their delegates to whoever wins the state popular vote. You aggregate that in the college, where each state, right, has as many delegates to the college as they have number of representatives in Congress, number of House seats that you have added to your Senate seats. So Nevada, for example, right, we have 4 members of the House, 2 members of the Senate. We get 6 delegates at the Electoral College, in the Electoral College. So that can produce, right, because it's an all or nothing proposition. If you win a state by 1 vote, you get all the delegates. If you win it by 3 million votes, like in California, you get the same number. So that can produce, somewhat odd outcomes where one candidate wins the national popular vote, but another candidate wins the electoral college. That was designed to insulate the president from direct popular pressure, to give the states a critical role to play in electing the president. And then finally, principle number 8, and then we'll be done. an amendment process, right? An amendment process. Because they recognized, right, they were not above making mistakes or not anticipating the future. They were flesh and blood, just like us, mere mortals. So they did build into the Constitution an amendment process, albeit that amendment process is difficult to access, I think, as it should be. Typically, you need 3/4 of the state legislatures and 3/4 of both houses of Congress to get an amendment passed. Very difficult to reach that high standard. So we have not had many amendments. Have not had many. The first ones we get, we'll see, are the Bill of Rights. But since then, only 17 additional amendments. 2 of those counteract each other, prohibition, the overturning of prohibition. So 15 in like 250 some years. That's not many. And some say it wouldn't have been enough for an 18th century document to remain relevant in the year 2023. So what we've done, I think, on the fly effectively is we've amended the Constitution, not through the amendment process so much, although some. I think we've amended it by the Supreme Court sort of creatively reimagining the Constitution over time. That's been sort of amendments on the fly through the courts. Not ideal, but it's the way we've kept this 18th century document relevant in the year 2023. I mean, just go back to the New Deal, right, where we finally create at the national level a welfare state and regulatory agencies to deal with these growing corporations. Would the founders have permitted that from Congress? Heck no. Heck no. Did the court justify the New Deal as a legitimate reading of the Article I powers of Congress? Yes, they did, but they had to get pretty creative to do that. Pretty creative. So I would argue that's been the more important amendment process, this continuously creative reimagining of the Constitution by the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm not saying that's ideal. It's probably not. But given how hard it is to amend the Constitution through the amendment process, and given how important it is to update an 18th century document pretty frequently to keep it useful, functional, and relevant, I'm a pragmatist. We've done it through the court, creatively reimagining that broad language. All right, so there you have it. Those are all of the key elements of the U.S. Constitution, as I see them at least, and as is supported in our text. So with all of that done, right, now it's time to release this document to the United States, to we the people, and get a debate going in the states, in the 13 states. And the rules of the game, as laid out by the Continental Congress, was, look, in order to ratify this as our new governing document to replace the Articles, you need 9 out of the 13 states to consent, to get majority votes that are relatively democratic. I believe in general, although women could not vote in these elections over ratification, slaves could not, indigenous people could not, indentured servants could not. Right, a whole lot of people could not vote, but, you didn't have to be a propertied white man to participate in these elections. Free blacks could vote in these elections in the 13 states. And you didn't have to have property, white or black. So a relatively democratic set of elections in the 13 states over ratification. And as we know, in anticipating the next set of slides, this is going to come down to a fundamental debate. On the one hand, the Federalists promoting ratification, and on the other hand, the Anti-Federalists opposing ratification. And I'll leave it there as a bit of a cliffhanger.